Right, so we're now in Module 4, which is all about building architecture capability. But just to quickly summarize, Module 2, we looked at the development of architectures, which is down the right-hand side of our architecture development method. Module 3, if you recall, we looked at the left-hand side, and that was all about transitioning architectures, migrating, planning, realizing them and governing them, and then also looking at techniques that you might actually want to be able to change your architectural thinking or your framework. Now in Module 4, we really look at the capability of architecture, and that's all around, well, how do I build an architectural team within an organization? What are the structures and processes and tools that I might want to use? And then also, we also look at things like hard and soft skills, specifically for individuals. In other words, well, what's a good mix of skills that we can apply, both in my team and also as an individual as I grow my career. Right, so in this topic, we're going to look at developing a capability. That is an architectural capability. And that deals with all of the skills, techniques, and processes required for me to be able to build an architectural practice. So now, just to take our car analogy a little further, if you recall, we're working through a cycle in which we're in essence building a car. And I introduced the concept of a shop floor and building multiple assembly lines to assemble that car till eventually it's on the lot and it's ready to go. Well, in this particular module, we're actually dealing with the team that's sitting up in the room overlooking the assembly line. And really, within that space, they've got to have certain skills, tools, and techniques to be able to design the car, not only the car, but also the assembly lines that are going to be building those cars. And then also looking at all the skills, tools, and techniques that need to be in place in order to make that assembly line effective and efficient. So that team sitting up in a room somewhere has to be fairly highly skilled in order to do that practice. And one of the challenges within the discipline is that, well, you can have bright boys sitting up there, but don't show them to any customers or stakeholders because their communication skills are quite weak. And that's why you'll hear me talk a lot about things like hard and soft skills. So really within this car analogy, that's the team that's sitting in that space. They're needing, for example, they're needing some clay for you to be able to shape the car. That's one of the tools that they need, but they're also needing some of the skills that they would need to be able to shape that car. And then they need to take that car and go down to some stakeholders or some sponsors and be able to talk through it and get their buy-in. And that's really similar to selling a business case. So those are some of the aspects that we're going to be dealing with as we go into building the architectural capability. All right, so when we're building an architectural practice, remember that a lot of that occurs within the preliminary phase. So let's draw our ADM again. And hopefully by now, you're all ready to draw this in your sleep because it's definitely an integral part to the TOGAF framework. All right. So here's the ADM again, and here is our preliminary phase sitting at the top. Now, building an architectural capability occurs within this phase, but there is an iteration that occurs, remember? So I have an iteration here, which is the architecture capability iteration, and that iteration also circles around that way. Now, what we want to deal with is within the preliminary phase. Now, when building a practice, you can actually take that preliminary phase and redo the ADM within the preliminary phase. In other words, here's the architecture vision. And just as you would do for your customers, for your stakeholders, out in the business, you now do that to yourself. In other words, there's a term which we use that is, you drink your own champagne, so to speak. Here is your architecture vision. There is your business architecture, information systems architecture, technology architecture, and all the way through migration planning right the way around. Now what you do is you actually take the techniques that you do for business and you do it within your preliminary phase to build the business of architecture. So what that means is here within the business architecture phase, I'm going to look at the processes, the people, the organizational structures that I'm going to need to develop in order to build a successful architectural practice. Similarly, as I move through the cycle and I get to information systems architecture, well, if you recall in Module 1, we dealt with the meta model and we dealt with the repository. Well, those are the pieces that you're going to build here within your information systems architecture. And well, those types of tools and tool sets are going to require a technology to execute on so that everyone in the business can view them and we can push it to a portal so everybody can see it and pull a series of reports with, and that's the technology architecture that sits here. Same as a business, there's a transition phase that you're going to need to execute against. In other words, I could have a fairly immature architectural practice today, but I want it to grow to a next level of maturity, maybe to a more managed level of maturity. Well, there's a current state of architecture and a future state. So that's what I do here. I plan the transition of my architectural practice. In other words, how do I move it from this state to the next? What's the business case? What are the changes that need to occur? Who are my sponsors? And what's the return on investment going to be? So you can see that within the context of building an architectural practice, we've drunk our own champagne, but we've done it within the preliminary phase. We've taken a spin through the wheel and we've produced an actual, let's call it a business model or an operating model for how I operate an architectural practice. Now, one of the important things to remember when I'm building the architectural practice is my maturity of my architectural practice. In other words, what it currently is and what the future maturity looks like. Now, one of the graphs we use for this really kind of looks at two dimensions. Looks at the level of architectural thinking. So let's just call this the think axis, all right? And this looks at the integration of that thinking into the organization. So let's call this just the do for now. All right? And really what it means is, well, within this space here, all right, this could be, we refer to it as a losing quadrant, which means that my thinking patterns around architecture are quite weak, and also the delivery of that thinking into the organization is quite weak as well. Right? As I move further up here, all right, I move into what's referred to as the isolated quadrant. Well, that's really a fairly common quadrant actually, but this means great architectural thinking, but the organization hasn't quite bought into it yet. So that's bright boys sitting in a dark room with propellers, right, and nobody really listens to them, okay? So, sometimes you might have heard the term ivory tower referred to in that space. Well, down here in this quadrant is a fairly common area, which is the fragmented area. And within the architecture discipline, that's probably the dominant space that we find as we go into organizations. This means that the way we execute architecture, right, the businesses does that a lot, but they do it at a more of a solution type of level. In other words, it's just for delivery. They're not looking at strategic levels. They're not looking at the broader value of what a strategic architecture can provide. So it only occurs in projects, so it's fairly fragmented. Right? And often this is the solution architecture space that would sit in. Right? Now, ultimately, in an ideal world, we'd want to get to an optimized quadrant. That means that great architectural thinking, and we're able to deliver that thinking effectively into the organization. So they've bought into it and they buy into it. Architecture is recognized as part of the decision-making process. They see the value of it. Right up at the strategic level, they want it to be involved. So that's really the quadrant that we want to get into. And then the downside is that you can't stay there all the time. So your organization is going to go up and down as your maturity waxes and wanes, as your organizational structures shift and change as well. So really, a lot of this would tend to occur here in your architectural vision piece. In other words, as I'm spinning through the smaller wheel within the bigger preliminary phase, I start to do a maturity assessment at my architecture vision phase, get an understanding of where I am, where do I actually want to go, what changes do I need to make.